Well, the title of my talk is Dangerous Creek, the Science, Media, and Public Perception of Fluvial Hazards, which is something I deal with in my work quite often. I took this slide in a subdivision of St. Louis County. The trustees of the subdivision decided that the best way to keep people out of the creek was to put a sign up. And it struck me because I played in a creek like this quite a bit when I was a child, and I never thought of them as being dangerous and still don't. But they can be if you don't understand them, and that's what a lot of this talk is about. In very timely fashion this morning, NPR ran a story. The crux of the story was about a new book by Stephen Flynn called The Edge of Disaster, and one of the things he talks about is extreme hazard in California's Central Valley, where they have levees that may not be sound even during a large flood, and certainly would probably not hold if during that flood they got a seismic event and those levees were shook. Really, the history of a lot of the history of humankind is one of dealing with floods, and certainly in North America and the history of our country, the United States, is one of floods. This is a sketch of a typical Mississippi flood scene, probably done in the late 1800s from a children's book, actually. This is from the Dartmouth Flood Observatory, and you can see in North America, these blue areas are for about a 1 decade period from 93 through 2006. The blue areas are areas that saw significant flooding. And so you can see sort of where the nexus of these things are. We have hurricane and tropical storm flooding in the coastal plain, flooding in the Mississippi Valley here, in the upper Midwest here, and in almost always in parts of California, particularly the Central Valley, you can see there. In Carbondale here, we're down at the confluence of two major rivers, the Ohio and the Mississippi, and this light blue area is the Mississippi Watershed, a gigantic watershed that served as a conduit for transportation and also has always been heavily settled, at least in the history of white folks in this country. And of course, Native Americans liked the river valleys too, but they didn't tend to build public, or rather permanent structures like we did. We like floodplains because they're fertile, they're great for agriculture, they're good for building, but they do have problems, and we run into problems when we try to build permanent structures in these floodplains. The first 3 decades in this country, or rather in the 20th century, saw incredible flood disasters in the Tennessee Valley, the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi Valley, and elsewhere. In 1927, a flood in the lower Mississippi Valley, one of the rare events where the Ohio and the Mississippi both saw very significant flooding, which means the lower Mississippi below that confluence also sees high flooding. Over 600,000 people were made homeless, and over 80% of those were poor African Americans. This is Vicksburg, Mississippi refugee camp in 1927. This was also a flood of long duration. It was a long time before these economies recovered, and a lot of the displaced African Americans never returned to those towns. There's actually a very good documentary done by the American Experience called Fatal Flood about this flood that I highly recommend. This is not far from here at all, Shawneetown, Illinois, during the 1937 Ohio flood. You can see the damage that's done. These houses were picked up and rolled over. These people lost pretty much everything they had at a time when there really wasn't much to help them with. This, I'm not sure where this was taken. Well, it was taken almost certainly in Louisiana, probably in the late 1800s, and it shows men trying to secure the ends of a levee that's breached. And here you can see history. This is from a Corps of Engineers document. How the 1882 levee and the 1896 levee and then the 1914 levees, as the levees continued to be overtopped, they made them bigger and higher. It still amazes me that in this period of time, using mules and scrapers, they could build thousands of miles of these large earthworks. Grand Forks, Minnesota in 1997, and those of you that are interested in media, this is a significant flood because for one thing, it destroyed the entire town. It wiped out $2 billion worth of infrastructure. And the town's historic buildings burned. The downtown core burned during the flood. They weren't able to put the fire out, which is not that unusual, but it also included and now the name escapes me, Herald is part of the name, but the local newspaper, which is a very, very vibrant newspaper, continued to publish, and of course there's some very interesting stories coming out of that since the newspaper was burned out of its building during the flood. This is Hull, Illinois, on the Illinois River in 1993. I took this from a light airplane, and one of the things I'll talk about is the media's role in public perception in great floods like this, and how it influences public policy. And one of the things that sometimes scientists like me can't understand is this sort of outpouring of sympathy for people who, at least in our state of mind, being very cold and scientific about it, really shouldn't be living there. We know this area is going to flood, it's just a matter of time. And so I was at the time a little frustrated with how the media was not talking at all about why these people were there and why they were being victims. And I'll never forget flying over this little town and looking down at this devastation, and my point of view changed completely. I felt nothing but sympathy for them. To see this entire little town under, at this point, you can see by the lines of water, it's actually up over the eaves of the roofs on these large industrial buildings. It was probably 10 to 12 feet deep at least there. So it completely wiped this small town out. That's a grain elevator. The grain, if there was grain left in these, the grain would swell and burst, and you can see the bottom of the elevator is burst, and tons of soybeans have spilled out into the water. Just a very sad sight to see. At the time, I'm not sure if Katrina has passed this, but I think it did. The flood of '93 was the most costly in U.S. history. And I won't read all of these items, but it was a very unusual event in its duration, for one thing. The river stayed high for a very long period of time. And that had significant effect on the media's coverage, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And I also would like to talk a little later about New Orleans and Katrina, because not everybody understands that really was a flood event. It was caused to some degree by the hurricane, but it really was a disaster caused by flooding and not by wind. Well, losing New Orleans is one thing, but when we see our cultural icons underwater, we know something's got to be done. And like McDonald's, floods are predictable, though, and we know that floods occur in floodplains. That's a very simplistic view of it, but it's true. What I said is just true. As far as media coverage and public policy go, we see the cycle I've got outlined here. We see a flood, great sympathy for flood victims, and rightly so, an outpouring of help that's often followed by politicians falling all over each other to get money to their home districts and also to appear to care. And then with short memory and a lack of political will to fix the actual roots and causes of the problem. And also, of course, time is passing. People forget. And I fault the media greatly for not keeping this in the public's mind. We often go back to step one and this thing repeats itself. And in fact, this has occurred time and time again in the United States and elsewhere. A shining example or exception to that has been the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which has done, I think, a very good job of keeping this in the public's mind. And this was a story done in 2003 on the 10-year anniversary of the 1993 flood. And the Post-Dispatch has done a great job of taking to task people who are now developing a lot of the areas in St. Louis that flooded in 1993. This is a plot of the annual peak flows, in other words, the highest flow for each year for the Mississippi River at St. Louis from 1901 to 2005. You'll notice we now have, we actually have a couple of discharges from the 1800s, but really we only have a little over 100 years of record. But these are all the peak flows, and you can see there certainly is a statistical range and patterns that we can observe. Here's the big one in '93. We mathematically manipulate those a little bit, and we get what's called a return interval analysis. This tells us discharge, of course, is the flow rate in the river, which, of course, greatly determines how high it gets. And then down here we have return interval in years. So about once every 100 years, we should expect to get this big one, and this is the 93 event. And then as discharges go down, our return interval goes down, or some of us would say would go up. About every 10 years, we'd expect to get a flow of 800,000 cubic feet per second through St. Louis there. There's a lot of confusion about this. It's a stochastic relationship. It doesn't mean that you can only get one of these flows every 100 years. It means every year you have a 1% chance of getting that flow. And it's not unusual at all at a given gauge to see 200-year flows pass, even in 2 consecutive years. Not unusual at all. Now I have the number 500 out here with a question mark because the Corps of Engineers and other powers that be are now in the process of building things they call 500-year levees in the St. Louis area. But as a scientist and mathematician, you know that we don't know what the 500-year flood is with only 100 years of record. It's unknowable. So this, of course, is a guesstimate. In fact, even these values are pretty fuzzy. We only have a few data points for these, but to determine the 500-year flood is difficult. Now, the things we do, we know, for example, that it's physically possible only for a certain amount of rain to fall a certain period of time in a certain area. There's physical limits to those things, and there's a thing called the probable maximum flood based on that. But you're really getting very statistically shaky when you go out onto this ground here. But what is a floodplain? This is the lower current river in the Missouri Ozarks. And I've drawn a cross-section here, a rough cross-section. You can see there's a valley walls on either side, a flat section in the middle, and then our low flow there. And that essentially is the floodplain. It's the area that's frequently, in this case, at least every few years, this area is inundated. And I'm going to show a short little, one of the things Little River Research and Design does now is, sorry, I should have an option to switch programs, but I'm not seeing it here. Yeah. We make videos of physical models, and this is going to show how these floodplains form. You're basically seeing geological time here, hundreds or thousands, or in some cases hundreds of thousands of years. But this is exactly how these floodplains form. The river meanders across them and forms this flat surface. And when you look at it in this context, you can see that all of this space in here is very much owned by the river. It frequently floods it, it built it, it moves the sediment around in it. That's why we call it the floodplain. This is very similar to what we see in real life, of course, and much, much slower. But in real life, you would expect in most river systems to see this entire area here flooded, at least on a 10, 15-year interval, at least, depending very much on the climate, the system, and natural history. And something I should throw in here is, when we talk about statistics in science, is that I haven't mentioned climate change. And from what we know from present modeling and estimates, if anything, climate change is going to make these floods bigger. And so that 500 becomes even fuzzier. This is a NASA Goddard simulation. This is the Missouri River at Rocheport. This is based on actual satellite imagery, but what they've done here is, this is before the '93 flood and then during the flood. So you can see again, here's an actual representation that shows you quite clearly where the floodplain is, and quite clearly areas that you build and live in at your own risk. And in fact, here too, you can actually see these green lines are levees that aren't doing much to keep the floodplain dry. Well, here's the natural system, the river floods, and we build levees along these river systems to hold the river back. The Chinese have been doing this for a very, very long time, which is one reason why, by some estimates, there have been 15, 20 million people killed in the last 200 years in China by floods, particularly on the Yellow River, when their levees have failed. In fact, some of the largest natural disasters in history, losses of life, have been floods on the Yellow River after levee failures. Well, we got rid of a lot of water here, but it had to go somewhere. And usually where that goes is in raising the elevation, or hydrologists call it the stage, in the river itself, which, as you can see, is sort of a vicious cycle. The closer the levee gets to the channel and the higher it gets, the higher the discharge rises. Which leads to, when these things do fail in these situations, we have catastrophic failures. This is exactly what happened in New Orleans. When you have 15, 20, 30 feet of water behind that levee and the thing fails, the water comes through very fast and does a lot more damage than it would have done if it had just risen slowly in a natural way. The usual situation we have is a river with floodplain on both sides, and usually structures and then levees holding that thing back. And one of the things we're seeing now, and indeed have seen in the past, is what we call Levy Wars, where, for example, in St. Louis now, the Corps of Engineers has actually built and is still working on 500-year levees on the Missouri side, but not on the other side. So if you raise it on this side, you're going to naturally put this levee at much greater risk of failure, and also people for flooding on either side. And in historic floods, we've seen all sorts of things where in the flood of 1927, there was great military effort and patrols by citizens along the levees to make sure the folks on the other side, who usually are not only another municipality but even another state, didn't dynamite the levee. And you probably remember wild rumors during 1993 of people doing that. There actually was one case where a man did get caught and convicted of dynamiting a levee. And this is what we see when these things fail, by holding this water back. When the water does find a breach and get through there, it causes incredible damage. And this is a shot of a failed levee on the Missouri River in 1993. Hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland were ruined by this process in Missouri, which was a mixed blessing because a lot of those were put in wildlife areas. So we look at a situation like this, and the thing I like to think about is sustainability. Is this something that is sustainable from now on out? Or is this something that's going to fail every few decades that we're going to have to replace at great public expense and loss of life and human misery? Well, we do have alternatives, and some of those are things like this. Flood-proofing our structures, so if the floodplain does flood, they won't be destroyed. Moving structures out of the floodplain, and then using these areas for uses that won't be so seriously affected by the flood, like this, a good use for a floodplain. Columbia Bottoms here at the junction of the Missouri and the Mississippi actually worked on this project. After '93, the farmers here said, forget it, we're going to sell this to the government, and so that's now a large wildlife area, which could care less and in fact will benefit from the flooding it will receive. This is a public campground on the Current River in Missouri, or Jack's Fork rather, in Missouri. This poor little, I've personally seen this poor little restroom here underwater 5 or 6 times, but it doesn't care. It's designed for that, and the rest of this is campground, and when it floods, the campers just move. These things aren't sustainable. This is a hydrograph, or the discharge over time for the Mississippi River at St. Louis during the flood of '93. The flood had a very long duration, most of July and August of 1993, and what that meant was the media had plenty of time to cover it, and so especially here, especially before the second peak, we had a lot of the typical sort of sensationalist things, you know, very little science, very little understanding why the flood, what was causing the flood, and why people were being victimized in the floodplain. But as the thing dragged on, we saw, especially with the Post-Dispatch, I actually monitored the media coverage for a grad student project. We saw it get much more sophisticated, which is why I think the Post-Dispatch is still doing a good job. This is that area. The arch would be here, Maryland Heights, where I've done quite a bit of consulting. Not on the Mississippi River, thank heavens, but this is the Chesterfield Valley. A lot of this area is being developed now behind 500-year levees, in quotes, especially in Maryland Heights and Chesterfield. This is Chesterfield, Spirit of St. Louis Airport. You know, this is I'm sure, quite costly jet aircraft that's, you know, been mostly destroyed. You can see the high water line on it here. The flood's actually receded. I mean, how can we sustain losses like that? And people, of course, here being rescued. We have a man I'm very impressed with here, Nicholas Pinter, in geology at SIUC, who studied these things and I think has been a great scientific voice for change. And this is from a science article, an article in the journal Science last year. He's obviously very concerned about what's going on here and has called for some common sense, or scientific sense rather, in the development that's happening in these valleys. This is from his paper. The blue area, the light blue area, was flooded, and you can see these brown areas are all being redeveloped since the 1993 flooding. And to my pleasant surprise, he actually did a LexisNexis search and found this information, which jibed very well with my personal experiences that, aside from the Post-Dispatch, there's been very little coverage of this problem. And this is from '93. The Post-Dispatch did a, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, did a special full 12-page pullout in November of '93. And you know, this is pretty typical. They're saying we need to break this cycle, the cycle I talked about earlier. And they had some very specific recommendations, which were promptly ignored by the people in Maryland Heights and Chesterfield Valley in particular. And I've already mentioned these things. The 2003 piece series was particularly good. And some of this, too, has been based, I should say, on Nicholas Pinter's work. And I found quite a few AP articles that came out as a result that were spurred by Dr. Pinter's research. And this is from the Post-Dispatch. This is what people need to see. You know, this ran in the Post-Dispatch. I couldn't find the source, actually, but probably in 1996. But every developer who moves into there, every business owner should see these photographs. During the flood, we tend to get media coverage that's very much based on things like this. You know, people are sandbagging. Flood fighting is a term people like to use. And again, this is Englehart, a Post-Dispatch cartoonist. I thought he did a good job with this one. He's got the weak-kneed Congress, greedy developers, scofflaw lenders, and selfish people, and taxpayers' money. And I think that's supposed to be a taxpayer. His cartoons, I thought, were always a little heavy-handed, but this ran in November of 1993. And you know, here's his joke: "Is welcome to Floodplain Acres." But here's the reality, and I apologize for the low-res photo, but this is a sign in Jefferson City, Missouri, in an area that was underwater in 1993, and the developer is actually calling his land that's for sale Floodplain Acres, to show you how little understanding there is of it. And this is from the Jefferson City News Tribune, actually ran this AP article, which again was spurred by Pinter's work. What we see often too is the rivers are sort of are demonized and treated as if they woke up one morning and decided to do some damage, when in fact these are predictable natural events. They're often treated by the media as unpredictable beasts. And you see rage and rampage used quite often. And when it comes to victims, this is from the Champaign-Urbana News Gazette, we see a lot of human interest stories. NOVA, the PBS science program, or I guess WGBH does that, I think. Actually, I and a lot of scientists from Illinois Natural History Survey, Illinois Geologic Survey worked with NOVA in '93 and '94 with high hopes that they would produce this scientifically based program, because we knew NOVA. It used to be one of my favorite programs. I'll never forget a mass meeting that we had with the producer, and she said, "I just want to warn you, we're the new NOVA. You know, people have a lot of options these days, and they change channels if they're not." And a few months later, after we gave them a lot of assistance, what we got was basically a long human interest story that talked about the poor people that were flooded out. And I don't think there were 3 or 4 minutes of science in the entire program. It was extremely disappointing. And for you students, I encourage you to visit this website to see how it's not done, because this is really nothing but a very flashy, and it's even geared towards teachers, unfortunately, but a very flashy presentation of disaster photos, basically, which is what we see in news coverage. There's nothing per se wrong with showing pictures like this, but we see, I went to the CBSnews.com site and was able to just find tons and tons of pictures of structures destroyed, and absolutely nothing on you know, why is this house sitting 20 feet away from the channel in the floodplain? This is from Post-Dispatch, the 2003 article. It's very telling. And I have to be careful because the Maryland Heights is one of my biggest clients.
We won't.
I don't deal with the development guys usually. And so he says, sure, in geologic time, the river's going to come over. And this is the real kicker here, is that the market's going to decide. Well, of course, we know the market doesn't pay for the flood damage. The government does. And so you can see some serious logical disconnects here. Now, this is from Galloway, quoted in the Post-Dispatch, who was put in charge of a massive study after 1993, which we all had high hopes for, and again, the conclusions of which were very good but are being largely ignored. But he talked about creating a moral hazard, which is what we're doing if we mislead people into moving back into these floodplains. And to be fair, I also have a similar quote from Russ Carnahan, the Democratic representative for that area. To me, this is another fallacy, is that our community has to develop to grow. We have to build more development to grow. A lot of us take exception to that. And when you use that excuse to build in the floodplains, you're putting yourself in serious peril. But it's been going on for decades. This is from the Elks magazine cover, 1953, when we had a huge boom of these small houses. People were moving into the suburbs, and I love this because obviously the salesman's selling mom here on the subdivision. Dad's looking out the window, and we have a suspiciously flat, wet area out here. And I'm wondering if they're building in the floodplain. I'd like to talk a little bit about how NOLA or New Orleans and Katrina and flooding. We heard a lot. There's so much blame to go around in this situation. I think if you bring this down just to politics and race or class, it's a mistake, because there's lots of blame to go around, and it's a very, very complicated issue. But nobody disputes that FEMA knew in 2001, listed this exact scenario as one of the three most likely and most serious disasters that could hit this country. And this warning was obviously ignored. As the hurricane came in, this star sits at New Orleans. New Orleans actually got very lucky as far as the hurricane went. It veered off to the right, and in the northwest quarter, as they call it, the hurricane hit New Orleans, which is actually the way you want to be hit, because the winds are magnified on the eastern and the northeastern quadrant. See, they're moving in this direction. So that's why there was so much devastation on the coast here. Houses were blown down. Very little wind damage, serious wind damage occurred in New Orleans. The wind was mitigated because it was against the motion of the hurricane. So when the hurricane hit, a lot of scientists say it was probably more like a class 2, the actual winds that they got there. But of course, they did have a storm surge. This is an old drawing of the Mississippi Delta. New Orleans is up here. But as a geomorphologist, and it was almost a standing joke among geomorphologists, it's not if New Orleans was going to be destroyed, but when. And of course, it's not funny to anybody, but there were estimates of tens of thousands of people being killed in the worst case scenario, and that might have happened if the hurricane had dead-centered New Orleans, and it really hit as a class 5. This is from a paper by Richard Sparks, another great scientist in Illinois who's done work on flooding. And it shows in the last 5,000 years, rather, the changes in the Mississippi River in New Orleans. Well, New Orleans sits here. So you can see there have been massive shifts. As the river brings loads of sediment down and forms deltas, it tends to shift back and forth. That's what rivers do here. And so imagine speeding this up as my model was sped up before. If you could see that, you wouldn't build anything there. And of course, there have been massive engineering structures along the river here to keep it in place. This is a satellite photo showing New Orleans, and you can see the sediment coming down and the distributary channels as well. It's not a good place to build a city. Here it sits on Lake Pontchartrain, really surrounded by water, much of the city below sea level. This is a Washington Post diagram showing how exactly it took some time for them to figure out, but there were different failure modes. But essentially what happened is the water in Pontchartrain, in this lake, and in the industrial canal here got high enough, it breached the levees and flooded the city. The storm surge and the high water, of course, was partly caused by wind, but the city was really destroyed by the flooding. This was predictable and, in fact, was predicted. And it was a flood disaster after levee failure. And one of the reasons I bring it up is, for me, the treatment of the victims was bizarrely turned on its head. We went from treating an outpouring of sympathy for victims and a rush to fix this flooding problem and help these poor people to actually blaming the victims in many cases. And I'm not a media critic, and this is not what I do, but I just had to do a little research on it because it's bothered me so much. And there are, in fact, quite a few papers out now. This is very interesting analysis. And in fact, it's well known amongst, I'm not sure media people, but sociologists, there's a disaster myth that's very common that when these disasters hit, there will be widespread lawlessness and looting. When the reality is people actually tend to band together, crime tends to go down, and people help each other. But we saw this, well, I don't watch TV, but apparently there was a lot of this sort of thing. And I highly recommend Spike Lee's documentary because he talks about how even some of the law enforcement officials who are African Americans actually exaggerated this, perhaps to try to get more help to the city, actually exaggerated the degree of this thing happening. And of course the media often repeated it without verification. When in fact, this was the reality for a lot more people. There were old people, sick people, people who couldn't evacuate. Many of these older folks have ridden out more than one hurricane. And they would have ridden out this one just fine if the levees hadn't failed. And then, of course, we saw this, one of my favorite guys, just jaw-dropping quotes from people who have a lot of influence on perceptions about folks. And this was quite famous. I think we've all seen this when the young African-American man, with a 12-pack of Diet Pepsi, which I'm sure he's got because he's probably needs something to drink, looting, and then white folks finding. I don't know how this ever worked itself out, but this is not unusual. This is from a sociology study that I thought was quite telling. This stuff didn't come out of nowhere. These are perceptions that have been around for a long time. And in fact, during the 1927 floods, there was widespread hysteria, probably because in some of those southern counties, like the ones I grew up in, at that time were probably 80% African American. And when the ruling class is only 20% and the flood comes, they worry a little bit about things getting evened out. Now, I contrast that with a story I found. This is a holdout, as they call them. In New Orleans, they were demonized. This holdout was in North Dakota, and it was a retired policeman who had restored this old carousel. And you can't see it here. He had sandbagged his house, and he wasn't going to leave. Well, he might have been putting other people at risk, including people that might have to come save him, but he was protecting this carousel. And so what we see here is a holdout that, of course, this is a very heartwarming story where he's lovingly restored this carousel and he's going to sandbag his house and protect it. So we really do see, not necessarily because of race or even class, but we see some wide disparities in the treatment of the so-called the victims in these floods. I thought that was a stark contrast. And then when we really turn things on our head, when we see Code Pink out, liberals for levees. Certainly in the Midwest here, we have, those of us on the left would like to see fewer levees, but here in New Orleans, they're protesting for more levees. And that's it. Okay. Thanks. Clap louder.